Thank you very much. Now, I said at the beginning that what we were trying to do is have a mix of different elements, you know, like a menu in our three-course meal across the 3 days. And certainly on the first day and the second day too, there is an essential part of that meal is to do some accessible but serious thinking about economics. So yesterday we're lucky enough to have Professor Bill Mitchell introduce us to modern monetary theory, and today we're fortunate to have his colleague and co-author on a best-selling new macroeconomics textbook which came out last year, and which, if you've had a mainstream education in economics, you must get a copy of. Professor Martin Watts from the University of Newcastle. I think we would all say that the outstanding MMT economist, especially in Australia, but more generally, is Bill. And I would like to say that clearly the second most important MMT economist, and neither of us that title in Australia for many years, has been Martin Watts. So it's a great privilege to be able to introduce Martin Watts now. Please welcome him. He's going to, well, I'll let him introduce the topic. Thank you.
I'm not sure that ranking's entirely warranted, but I'll take it anyway. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. Secondly, I'd like to thank Stephen and all his team for putting this conference together. I think it's been very successful, and the number of registrations is a very good indication of the interest in MMT and related issues. Now, Bill made the point yesterday that education is what it's all about, that familiarity or casual familiarity with MMT isn't enough. And I certainly support that view. And I think part of the agenda is espousing what MMT is about in a very formal and quite precise way, which he embarked on yesterday. But equally, it's very important to understand what our Orthodox critics are all about. What are they claiming? And this talk is designed to give you some insights as to why orthodoxy is basically a load of nonsense. Now, orthodoxy comes in various different packages, in other words, schools of thought, and it's simply impossible for me to identify different schools of orthodox thought and talk about their principles and so on. So I'm trying to talk about some of the key propositions they come up with and immediately confront those propositions with the ideas of MMT. Okay, so really, while MMT particularly in the last 12 months, has acquired a much higher profile internationally and more recently domestically, of course in the policy debate orthodox thinking really still prevails. It's worth noting, and I'm not going to go into a long monologue about MMT, it embraces chartalist and functional finance principles, chartalism relating to the currency and the capacity to spend the currency and the distinction between currency issuers and currency users. Functional finance comes from Adelaide, in which he argued basically governments should pursue public purpose, the terminology that's currently used, and the deficit and debt outcome is irrelevant, a point, of course, that Bill made yesterday. And something which I think is really important is that MMT is grounded in institutional practice, and what I mean by that is what banks and central banks actually do, not what some arcane orthodox textbook says they do. So the focus of the paper is to highlight the deficiencies of the orthodox framework by reference to MMT and other heterodox insights. And as I say, it is important from a point of view of presenting MMT to understand the criticisms, and the general point would be that heterodox economists in general have a much better understanding of orthodox principles than orthodoxy themselves. So I'm going to outline it and critique the orthodox conception of how the economy functions in a very simple way, the operation of the money system and the conduct of monetary and fiscal policy. And one of the main foci of the paper is the long-standing dominance of monetary policy, which goes back to the early 70s when Friedman managed to conjure up enormous ideological hostility to fiscal policy. I should acknowledge the fact to those who've been to talks of mine in Melbourne and Sydney that you'll be getting a bit of a rerun along the way. And finally, subject to time, I want to reflect very briefly on some current orthodox policy options, including from Lawrence Summers, who is quoted in the US Senate motion which condemned modern monetary theory. So, two different perspectives on how the economy works. First of all, orthodoxy. In first year microeconomics, we teach students that competitive markets clear. In other words, establish a price or a wage at which demand and supply are equal. And then orthodoxy generalizes that very simple proposition to the macroeconomy. That is, it achieves some notion of full employment, often referred to by Friedman and since as the natural rate of unemployment. The generalization of micro principles to macroeconomics often entails the fallacy of composition. In other words, the simple proposition that you cannot generalize micro principles and come up with a sensible macro proposition. I'm not going to go into detail about that. So, a basic belief in the market system means that orthodoxy wants the market system to be able to function in the best way possible. So, deregulate private markets, privatize public assets, essentially to force the actual economy to conform to some degree to the textbook version. And of course, government is not afforded any particular significance other than the fact that they should defend our property rights and defend our shores, and some extreme individuals would argue that's basically what they should do. So small government is definitely an option, and there used to be lots of discussion about small government. So we want low taxes and low government expenditure, and let households make the decisions they want to make about their disposable incomes. Now, markets allegedly reward individuals according to their economic contributions. There's no need for significant intervention in the market system. We should scrap minimum wages, etc., etc. Now, an important contributor to the development of these ideas was Friedman, and his work with Phelps in the 60s about active monetary policy being required to control inflation has been very, very influential. And the view is that low, stable inflation provides an appropriate economic environment for good decision-making. Now, let's immediately confront that view of the economy. The central claim of heterodox economists, including MMTers, is that total output and employment is driven by effective demand. That is total spending. That is not window shopping. I would like to, but I don't have the money. It's actual capacity to spend and indeed engage in spending. Unemployment and underemployment are regular features of a capitalist system, along with more serious and intermittent crises. So the underutilisation of labour is not explained by a malfunctioning market system. And you may remember the periods of microeconomic reform which were designed to make the overall economy function better, allegedly. So macro policies needed to ameliorate persistent labour underutilisation, whether it be unemployment and or underemployment. So we need more spending. It's worth reflecting on J.K. Galbraith, father of Jamie Galbraith, who's a heterodox economist and an MMT-er. He talked about private affluence and public squalor. Private affluence arising from this economy of small government, which doesn't provide any facilities, infrastructure, etc. Now, let's move on to inflation, because this has been critically important in the tenor of policy for over 40 years. Now, Friedman and Phelps assumed notoriety, if that's the appropriate word, because they anticipated the breakdown of a long-run relationship between inflation and unemployment in the late 1960s. This relationship had been found for the UK by a New Zealander called Phillips. The idea of a stable trade-off meant government actually had some choices. They could choose quite high inflation and lower unemployment, or higher unemployment and lower inflation. Now, the notion of that trade-off was severely undermined by the response of governments to the OPEC price shocks through raising the price of oil. And the reason that the trade-off was undermined was that the effect of contractionary policy when inflation rose due to the quadrupling of the oil price was that the inflation persisted but unemployment rose. So clearly the trade-off had broken down. And Friedman and Phelps were around really at the right time, because they had developed a quite complicated and somewhat ambiguous theory of inflation called the expectations augmented Phillips curve, which, in a sense, anticipated the breakdown of this trade-off. And therefore, they achieved much academic influence, and indeed came to Australia. Well, Friedman came to Australia in 1975, arguing his monetarist principles. Now, the two ingredients of this theory, and I'm not going to go into technical detail about it, is firstly the role of inflationary expectations, that people have a view as to what the rate of inflation is, and if subsequently the rate of inflation changes, then slowly their view of the inflation rate changes too. That expected rate of inflation contributes to the actual rate of inflation, because people will try to push, or workers will try to push for higher money wages if they believe the rate of inflation is going to be 5%. They want at least 5% to maintain their real wages. And if there are market pressures operating as well, you've got two components contributing to the inflation rate. The second component, which I've touched on already, is the natural rate of unemployment, this so-called full employment rate of unemployment, which reflects market imperfections. So minimum wages, price supports, rent controls, and those sort of micro-based imperfections. And given that the natural rate was exclusively influenced by these imperfections, the NRU is cyclically invariant. In other words, it doesn't matter what the economy is doing, there is a particular rate of inflation rate of unemployment where inflation is stable, because expectations will adjust to the prevailing rate of inflation and there's no market pressure. So the natural rate of unemployment is therefore a barrier to lower unemployment. if government stimulates the economy by fiscal policy to reduce unemployment below the natural rate, then the inflation rate rises above its expected rate, which will then feed into expectations. And people's expectations of inflation will increase, and they will push for higher money wage increases than before, and this will contribute to a rise in inflation. And if that fiscal stimulus continues, then inflationary expectations continue to adjust upwards, and this is unsustainable. And so on that basis, discretionary fiscal policy got a bad name. It was trying to do something that was impossible because the NRU was really a barrier to economic expansion. Now, inflationary expectations feature in inflation models now, and that's an important insight, that people's expectations of inflation contribute to the rate of inflation depending on their market power. In terms of the NERU, Bill Mitchell did work back in the 80s and talked about hysteresis, the idea that the NERU or NRU, natural rate of unemployment, moved with the cycle. And indeed, OECD and Treasury estimates of the Australian natural rate or NERU rate of unemployment, which guide policy, actually followed the actual rate. So in other words, the NRU is not cyclically invariant. And we talk about it in our textbook, and really what I'm doing in this talk is to distill some key ideas that come from the textbook, and I've added on a bit more. So the NERU is cyclically sensitive. Growing underemployment, of course, has been a feature really since the last Australian recession in the late 80s, early 90s. If you combine this idea of a cyclically sensitive NERU and the role of underemployment, then you really restore a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, which means you can stimulate the economy and you don't suffer ever-increasing inflation. And of course, Bill touched on the fact that there are alternatives to a NERU-based theory of inflation and the policy consequences, namely an unemployment buffer stock. And he talked about the job guarantee and the notion of an employment buffer stock. Now, continuing on with Friedman, he believed in what's referred to as the quantity theory of money. It's based on the idea that there's a link between the money stock and the speed that it circulates around the economy and the value of nominal GDP. In fact, the way these terms are defined, it's an identity. In other words, it always holds. Now, identities are useful in economics, but the devil is in the detail. In other words, how do you interpret the identity? Now, the money stock is current account deposits plus cash in circulation held by the non-government sector. That's the narrow definition of the money stock. The V, as I say, is some idea of the speed of circulation of the money around the economy. Y is real GDP, and P is the price level. And so we can express this identity as shown by the equation there. And then you can say, well, if velocity is constant, then the growth of the money supply equals the growth of the price level plus the growth of real output. So policymakers would say, OK, we think real output's going to grow 3%. We want inflation to be 2%. Therefore, we're going to expand the money supply 5%. And that's the way we control inflation. If we increase the money supply 6%, we'll have 3% inflation, and so on. So the belief was the central bank could control the money supply. because it could control the monetary base. Now, the monetary base is the cash in circulation plus bank reserves. Now, bank reserves are held at the central bank, but they're also in the form of bulk cash, what they hold on site. The reason that the central bank could control the money supply was allegedly that they could control the monetary base, and then there was the operation of the so-called money multiplier. Money multiplier is based on banks being subject to some either voluntary or imposed reserve obligations. They've got to hold reserves to accommodate customers coming in and wanting to withdraw funds or withdrawing funds electronically. Subject to leakages from the bank, after new deposits appear in the banks, the assumption is banks lend them out. Quite simple. We've got more reserves, we'll simply lend them. We've got reserves over and above what we want. Now, subject to leakages from the banking system, due to households perhaps wanting more cash, further new deposits are then made, because when people borrow money and spend it, the money comes back into the banking system as new deposits. And so with further new deposits, there are further loans. And the process continues. It doesn't explode. The money multiplier, the relationship between the initial deposits and the final expansion of the money supply, is the inverse of this reserve ratio. So we've got a link from allegedly from central bank behaviour to the money supply, and equally we've then got a link from the money supply growth to inflation. And so if the central bank does the right thing, according to orthodoxy, it will control the rate of inflation. Now, what are the problems with that? Well, the problems are many. Firstly, the quantity theory of money is true as an identity, but we don't have a given real GDP growth. Often the quantity theory is framed in terms of full employment, and that, as we know from the first bit of the discussion, cannot be guaranteed in the absence of sufficient expenditure, but more to the point, the velocity is variable. So there is not a predictable relationship between the left-hand side, MV, and PY. Secondly, banks simply don't lend reserves. They are not financial intermediaries. Banks make, sometimes, sensible decisions based on their view of the creditworthiness of borrowers and the profitability of making a loan. After the event, after they made the decision, they may want to hold more reserves. But this temporary shortage doesn't constrain their lending. And this is institutional practice. This is what they actually do. So deposits don't drive loans, and hence the money supply. The central bank does not control the monetary base. It doesn't decide to impose more reserves on the banking system, because the banking system won't necessarily want those reserves, and that will cause problems, as we shall see. So this link between central bank decisions and the money supply, and therefore inflation, is completely rejected by modern monetary theorists, and indeed many heterodox economists too. Now, this view about the significance of monetary policy has persisted since 1975. The idea of trying to target the growth of the money stock to get the desired rate of inflation was soon discarded, simply because it was impossible to control the monetary base. The central bank did not control it. As we all know, the Reserve Bank and many other central banks target a short-term interest rate. to control inflation, or allegedly to control inflation. Yes, attention may be paid to the money stock, but attention is paid to a whole lot of different macroeconomic data. Of course, in Australia, the target inflation rate band was introduced in 1993. Now, monetary policy, as many of us will know, remains the primary arm of policy, despite the impact of interest rate changes being subject to long and uncertain lags. And BOE is the Bank of England. So here we have a central bank, a very influential central bank, saying, well, yes, we conduct monetary policy through adjusting interest rates, but actually we don't know quite the magnitude or the timing of the effects of monetary policy. Now, monetary policy dominance has persisted post-GFC, but of course the ineffectiveness of conventional monetary policy, in other words interest rate adjustment, has led to unconventional monetary policy in a number of countries noted on the slide, and the typical form of unconventional policy is quantitative easing. And that takes the form of the central bank buying financial assets, typically long-term financial assets, from the non-government sector, including the banks. And that drives up the price of those financial assets and drives down the yields. Now, this total obsession with monetary policy does face a very fundamental problem, which we occasionally get exposed to in the media when the Reserve Bank is trying to work out how it's going to proceed. We're trying to achieve full employment. If you read the charter for the Reserve Bank, it talks about full employment, stable inflation, and they may or may not be compatible, given the way policy is conducted. And occasionally the Reserve Bank expresses concern about the growth in asset prices. So you've really got three different targets, some of which may be conflicting, and you've got one instrument, and that ain't going to work. So what's the critique of all this? Well, we've got the so-called independent central bank setting a target rate. The focus is unambiguously on the inflation rate. The view is if you can hit the target inflation rate, then everything else will be fine. In this country, as we know, we haven't been hitting the target inflation rate. And as I've already indicated, the problem with, well, there is a problem with monetary policy in that you cannot guarantee that borrowers will respond to a lower or higher interest rate. And specifically post-GFC, we've been confronted with more so in other countries, but to some degree in Australia, and particularly recently, we've been confronted with a stagnant economy where we're trying to encourage people to spend more. And Keynes, way back, pointed out that expected returns in the context of investment reflected so-called animal spirits, and that was much more important than changes, fairly small changes, in the interest rate in terms of the decision by firms to borrow for investment. It's worth acknowledging domestic interest rates can influence consumption, particularly durable consumption involving borrowing. It also influences the exchange rate. Central banks have added forward guidance to their kit bag of policies, so to speak, where they say they're much more upcoming in terms of their future plans. So we await the February decision with some interest. In summarising the impact of monetary policy since the 70s, it has led to higher unemployment rates than in in the immediate post-war period. And we now confront, in this country and in other countries, low official interest rates, which have major distributional consequences, stagnant GDP growth, and in many countries, very low inflation rates. Now, the question is zero the effective lower bound for the policy rate? Well, as many of you may know, some countries have moved into negative territory, Switzerland, Japan, and the European Central Bank. So they have modest negative policy rates. Now, if banks impose those rates on depositors, they may well lose some deposits. But there are other ways of making money out of depositors, and that includes fees and charges. So there hasn't been widespread imposition of negative rates on depositors in these countries. And if you're disgusted with the bank because it does impose a negative deposit rate on you, you have to think of the consequences of not having a bank account for transaction purposes and how you're going to get paid. So with small negative interest rates, which actually impact on deposit interest rates, the withdrawal of cash is likely to be fairly small. People will just grin and bear it. Again, the argument is that banks who are now receiving negative rates will economise on holding reserves because they're getting paid a negative rate, and they'll lend more. But again, banks don't use reserves for lending. Now, some IMF employees, these 4 authors cited at the bottom of the slide, as well as Lilly and Rogoff, academic economists, even advocate deep negative interest rates. And in reading their work, it's very interesting that in those 3 papers, unemployment is mentioned once. And the name of the game is, as I mentioned earlier, achieving the target inflation rate. And if you do that, according to these authors, then you will, your problems will be solved in terms of the macroeconomy. Now, a quote from the academic authors: an elegant and effective tool to restore monetary policy effectiveness at the zero bound. So in other words, there isn't this asymmetry where rates above can move up, but you can't move down below the zero bound. By having the capacity to impose deep negative interest rates, we've removed that constraint. So this is an interesting quote, it seems to me. Elegance is taken precedence over any notion of effectiveness. And it is a bit, has some resonance with the idea of building very elegant models where the mathematics is persuasive, but the underlying assumptions are totally flawed. Now, just finishing off on deep negative interest rates, the problem that these authors address is the fact that households will, if they're getting minus 5% on their deposits, will actually start closing accounts, or at the very least withdrawing cash from their accounts. The IMF authors have developed sophisticated ways of imposing a negative rate on cash, so to deter cash being withdrawn. Of interest is the fact that neither the Fed nor the RBA and nor the Bank of England favour deep negative interest rates. None of those countries have adopted even negative interest rates. And both Carney and Lowe recognise the need for complementary policy and, in other words, moving away from reliance solely on monetary policy. And certainly not relying on deep negative interest rates. Now I want to reflect fairly quickly on the orthodox hostility to fiscal policy. And this can be captured by the so-called government budget constraint, or what we prefer to call a fiscal constraint, because governments don't strictly have budgets. On the left-hand side, we have essentially, if it's positive, we have the fiscal deficit. So it's government spending minus the receipt of taxes plus what they are spending in terms of interest payments on outstanding debt. On the right-hand side, we have the change in the monetary base and the change in the stock of bonds. So in other words, this is, according to orthodoxy, is a financing equation. It's something that policymakers think about in advance of spending. How am I going to finance the deficit? I can either, through the monetary authority, increase the monetary base, or I can borrow. So if the Treasury anticipates a deficit of 10 billion, how will it be financed? Now, of course, unlike us, it appears that the government has an extra option, or the Treasury has an extra option, namely what orthodoxy calls printing money, this change in the monetary base. Printing money is a very powerful metaphor. And there's a whole chapter about this in the book. I think it's chapter 7. No, it's not chapter 7. Anyway, it's round 7 or 8. The inference is that so-called printing money will cause the inflation rate to rise. It is still used by academics and commentators to disparage fiscal policy and modern monetary theory more generally. Now, why is orthodoxy hostile to budget deficits? Well, as Bill mentioned yesterday, the argument is if government finances its net expenditure by borrowing, then there is more demand for finance in the economy, both from the government now, but also from the private sector. And inevitably interest rates will rise. And this will have a negative effect on investment, which is allegedly interest rate sensitive, although I argued earlier that it wasn't. Increasing the monetary base is claimed to raise the money supply via the money multiplier, which I discussed, which then feeds into the price level via the quantity theory of money. If fiscal deficits persist, it's argued there is a possibility of hyperinflation. And the other issue with persistent deficits is that debt may become unsustainable. So the message here is that surpluses are the go. Good economic management is associated with running surpluses. Therefore, you really should have a businessman as treasurer, and our problems would disappear because they understand what costs and revenues are. In other words, government spending and taxes. Now, how do we actually interpret this budget constraint? Well, as I say, it is supposed to be a sort of planning tool for the Treasury. Now, we have a body called the Australian Office of Financial Management, and what it does is to sell debt in anticipation of what the budget deficit is going to be. So the budget deficit is going to be 10 billion. Over the year, it will sell $10 billion worth of debt. And clearly the impression given here is that this is what governments have to do. If they're going to overspend, they've got to borrow. Now, the Debt Management Office in the UK does the same thing. It argues or acknowledges that full funding is a policy decision, and it's making an institutional separation between so-called debt management and monetary policy, and to achieve transparency with respect to spending. So if the auction system is all about selling $10 billion worth of debt, that's obviously what the powers that be think the deficit's going to be. And everybody knows about it and can say it's good, bad, or indifferent. Orthodoxy also believes that, and I think Bill touched on this, that borrowing is the least inflationary way of financing the deficit. That does conflate the decision to save from portfolio choice, and I might say a bit more about that later, or I can pick it up in questions. Now, why would a monopoly issuer of currency, such as the RBA, such as Australia, the US, UK, and so on, why would it issue debt when it's the monopoly issuer and it can repay dollar-denominated debt? That is a fundamental issue. If it seems crazy that you would actually sell debt in a currency that you have a monopoly over the issuance. Modern monetary theory is quite clear. The purchase and sale of debt is an interest maintenance operation. Bill, of course, believes debt purchases and sales should be scrapped. And it's all tied in with monetary policy. Reserve Bank sets the target interest rate, which underpins all interest rates in the economy. They must make sure that this target rate is achieved. Financial uncertainty would certainly grow if that target rate was not achieved. Putting aside the full funding rule for the moment, what happens when government net spends? Well, bank reserves rise. Now, why is that? Because there are sellers of goods and services to government, because government spending, and their bank accounts increase. Now, the RBA has a corridor system. It has a rate that it charges banks to borrow, and obviously can't go into a lot of detail about this, currently 1%. The target rate, the rate that we all hear about on the first Tuesday of each month, except December and January. Oh, sorry, except just January. So we have the cash rate at 0.75, and then the rate that banks get on their holdings of reserves, which is 25 basis points lower. If there are excess reserves after this government spending and there's RBA inaction, the actual bank interbank rate will fall below the target, and there will be an excess, and this compromises monetary policy. And Bill talked about this yesterday. Now, what the Reserve Bank has to do is to try to mop up those excess reserves, and that's why it offers banks debt which they can buy as much or as little as they want, so they have an alternative to holding the excess reserves. So it is not a financing strategy for government, it is in fact an interest rate maintenance operation. And so you can put some figures, if you want, to the government, so-called government budget constraint or fiscal constraint, and you might say, well, banks may wish to hold slightly higher reserves after $10 billion worth of net spending. So the right-hand side will be a mix of debt issue to soak up the liquidity and the holding of additional reserves. So what we've done here is to confront the so-called budget constraint and argue that it's simply nonsense in terms of its interpretation. Government strictly doesn't have to borrow. It can choose to, and this is how the system works currently. Now, I'm acutely aware that time is getting away from me, so I'm going to very quickly talk about public debt and interest rates, because this is something that concerns people. Morrison talks about maxing out the credit card, leaving future generations debt which they've got to pay interest rates on, and so on. And to be very quick, I am first of all here looking at gross debt of Eurozone countries. And I put a line through approximately when the GFC started, and you can see that all those Eurozone countries experienced a rise in gross public debt. Now, that was not in the main due to expansionary fiscal policy by governments in those countries. It was largely an automatic stabiliser operating. Private spending collapsed to a significant degree. Tax receipts fell, and therefore the budget went more into deficit, and that contributed to the rise in debt. Now, the question is, what about interest rates on long-term debt? And what you see here is, prior to the GFC, the countries, and there are about 6 or 7 there, including Greece, Spain, Ireland and Portugal, what they were paying in terms of interest rates on long-term debt were pretty much the same. Investors didn't differentiate them. Once the crisis occurred, then we see Greece's interest rate on its debt rose dramatically. And, of course, Greece, even in the last few years, has been suffering greatly and almost collapsed because Greece is not currency sovereign. All the Eurozone countries are using a foreign currency. Now, why did these rates converge towards the end? The actions and promises of the ECB. Now, let's quickly contrast that with some currency sovereign economies, and you see Australia in the green, where we've got a very low debt ratio prior to the GFC, and it's gone up since, and all the others went up to varying degrees. What happened to their long-term bond rates? They all came down. Why did they come down? 2 reasons. Central banks cut rates, and of course they're still cutting them here. Most countries have got as low as they can, and in some cases gone below the zero band. Secondly, a realisation this debt is perfectly riskless, because this debt is denominated in the currency of issue by the particular country. And that is of fundamental importance and explains why there is not going to be a long-term or future crisis, and particularly if you look at Japan, which has the lowest rates and has the highest gross debt to GDP ratio. That red line going skywards, 225%. Okay, now I could also talk about why fiscal surpluses are unsustainable. Bill made the point that it depletes the net financial assets of the non-government sector. I won't say any more than that, that's of course unsustainable. What I'll end up talking about is the conclusion. I can talk about Lawrence Summers, who doesn't like MMT. Let me conclude. There is an ideological hostility to fiscal policy and a tacit acceptance of monetary principles which have persisted ever since the 70s, ever since this post-war consensus about the operation of fiscal policy to achieve high levels of employment. We've had this reliance on monetary policy. This reliance has continued in the post-GFC period, albeit complemented by unconventional monetary policy. It's all about, as Stephanie said yesterday, encouraging the private sector to borrow despite private sector debt. And now the obsession with monetary policy is continuing with the view that we should have actually negative rates and high negative rates. The view persists about the importance of the inflation target and getting there, and then everything will be fine. There is some grudging recognition that some stimulus is required, but some of these orthodox economists are very ambiguous about what the possible dangers are. And I think I might as well stop there, because I'm just repeating what the idea of the paper was, which you've got some idea about now. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's quite something to do. Professor Watts has just given us a masterly description of really the history of macroeconomics since the 1960s, and the impact that's had on macroeconomic policy. I very much appreciate him doing that, and we will have recorded that lecture, and when I get some sleep and get round to editing these things on about Tuesday, then we'll make it available, as we will all the talks, on via our site, and I'll certainly be watching it again very soon. We have just a few minutes for some questions, if anyone would like. Well, there's a gentleman at the back in the blue T-shirt, Lachlan, actually.
Thanks, Professor Watts. I'm a economics master's student in Canberra. I want to ask you, this is slightly outside of the theoretical realm, and I sort of want to ask you about...
Could you just speak up a bit?
I want to ask you about the social and sort of class context in which your work, Professor Mitchell's work and others' work has developed versus the orthodoxy, because it strikes me that it's no coincidence that economists primarily from, shall I use a Marxist term, a bourgeois sort of background, who are surrounded by consultants and other people in the white-collar, upper-middle-class professions, generally have been quite comfortable with the idea of a large buffer stock of unemployed people. I remember an economist in Canberra saying in a fairly dreadful article attacking MMT about 6 months ago that, well, economists accepted that full employment is 5%, so MMT is a solution in search of a problem because unemployment's 5.2%. What's the point in a fiscal expansion to reduce it by a couple of percentage points? Whereas I noticed that people like yourself, people like Professor Mitchell and others who've actually been working in working class communities for essentially your entire careers, and have actually, unlike orthodox economists, been working alongside trade unionists and various others for your entire careers, have essentially been discerning from the beginning what is apparent to any person on the street, which is that unemployment's not a natural phenomenon at all, that it's morally unacceptable and so on. So I was wondering if you might reflect on the class context in which the work of the MMT economists has been done, particularly in these working class communities from the beginning, as opposed to a very sort of sheltered and I guess you'd say bourgeois kind of context in which a lot of orthodox economic theory has been developed.
Yes, that's a bit of a challenging question. One point I would make is that Philip Lowe seems to think that 4.5% unemployment will ignite the inflation rate in terms of getting it back within its target range. Yes, I mean, I think, not exactly answering the question, there is the view, the sort of Tina view, that Margaret Thatcher espoused back in the late 70s, early 80s, that there is no alternative. And you mentioned the natural or unnatural nature of the unemployment rate. So I think there's an element of the view that, well, this is the economic system, it settles down at a particular rate of unemployment and we've simply got to live with it, and if we try to do something to reduce that rate, then we're going to get into serious inflationary problems. And as I mentioned, I mean, Bill's work suggests that we can have a lower rate of unemployment and without inflation ever accelerating. clearly, our views about the importance of unemployment in terms of obviously minimising it is very much founded on very reputable work. And again, Bill mentioned this yesterday, in terms of the adverse effects of unemployment in psychological effects, economic effects, social effects, and so on. And it's always really been the case that a government that does try to get to low levels of unemployment will always miss out on picking up everybody who has the capacity to work. And this is why a job guarantee is advocated. So I've sort of evaded the question, but I think at least tried to indicate why we take the rate of unemployment very seriously, and we're not prepared to simply accept, that 5.2% is the appropriate rate. We're not comfortable with it. And the other point I would make, and Bill touched on this in his talk, was those three elements that contribute to the rate of labour underutilisation. The official unemployment rate, underemployment, typically should be adjusted to take account of hours, not simply bodies, and those who are discouraged. And in fact, Coffey years ago started constructing a series which captured all three. And the rule of thumb, which probably doesn't exactly apply anymore, it's worse, is if you double the official rate of unemployment, that gives you some sort of idea as to the rate of labour underutilisation. Okay, let's have another question.
Perhaps can we come round here to this gentleman? Well, could you just wait a minute so we get a microphone? Otherwise, only because we won't pick you up on the recording. Otherwise, thanks very much. And we'll probably have to make this the last question for the moment. Again, Martin is a very friendly guy, so I hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to have a chat with him. Well, those of you that have questions anyway later. Thanks.
Well, Australia is very dependent on foreign investment, also on balances trade. We have to obviously balance that to sustain our prosperity. How much do we have to bow to these outside pressures to do our financial policies on that?
Well, we have a flexible exchange rate, and essentially, the exchange rate does exhibit quite significant fluctuations, which does create some problems. You may remember when mining was going through its boom, when the Australian dollar was above parity with the US dollar. Now it's obviously rather lower, but it didn't do much good to domestic manufacturing. So that is an issue, but essentially we can run our own race. Now this is highly controversial, I guess, within heterodox economics generally. Is it not the case that if you commit to full employment that the dollar will get sold off, etc., etc.? Well, in the short term it might, but the point is, if you're an aspiring foreign investor and you're thinking of investing in a country which has a commitment to full employment, which is very good for business, we tend to focus on the impact on unemployment, but a fully employed economy is good for business, subject to obviously having the job guarantee in place, so you do have a counter-inflation sanction. So the exchange rate may go down in the short term, but in the longer term I suspect it would return, because foreign investors would see good opportunities for investment in the local economy. And to bring in Mr. Morrison and his late conversion to actually spending some money on the bushfire crisis, I think it's going to be a quite buoyant environment in terms of all sorts of different forms of investment to alleviate some of these issues. Can I finally just mention a couple of things? Firstly, obviously, these slides that you've been looking at, there are more of them, because I skipped through a couple of sections. I also have a long version of this, which I'll hand over to Steve, and if that can be put somewhere, and you might find that if you want to follow up on this talk, then you may find that quite useful if you want to.
Okay, and if I could just say very quickly, first of all, Australia's trade deficit, if you want to look at when it was at its maximum level, it was under the John Howard government, if you are concerned about that kind of thing, when there was a government budget surplus. But secondly, it's strange, isn't it, that we run our economic policy at the moment on the basis that it's a problem if there are enough jobs. It's a problem if unemployment is too low, because you might have noticed at the same time what a punitive attitude our government takes towards people who are actually unemployed while not providing enough employment opportunities. And that's one of the reasons why one of many reasons why I'm in favour, as Martin is, of what I believe should be a voluntary, not work for the dole, a voluntary job guarantee, so that everybody has the opportunity of meaningful and fairly paid employment, and nobody is forced to be involuntarily unemployed or underemployed or insecurely employed and having to deal with the job active network and having to deal with being vilified publicly. So if you could thank very much Professor Watts for what was a great talk.